The cold was a physical thing. It was not merely an absence of heat, but a presence, an entity that stalked the narrow, frozen ruts of the town's main street. It sank its teeth into the packed mud, glazed the horse troughs with a skin of brittle ice, and painted the insides of window panes with intricate, unfeeling ferns of frost. It was the kind of cold that made a man's breath hang in the air like the ghost of a word he wished he had never spoken, a lingering, visible regret. For the man who watched from the doorway of the mercantile, the cold was an old and familiar companion, a reflection of the vast, quiet emptiness that had settled inside him years ago. He was a solitary man, carved from the same hard granite as the mountains that loomed over his isolated ranch. His face was a map of weather and silence, his eyes the color of a winter sky just before a storm. He did not come to town for company. He came for necessity, salt, flour, cartridges, and conducted his business with an economy of movement and word that discouraged conversation. He was finishing his transaction, nodding a curt thanks to the proprietor when he saw them. They were huddled in the sliver of space between the assay office and the shuttered bakery, a space deliberately designed to offer no shelter. A woman and two children, a boy and a girl. They were outsiders. That much was clear from the thinness of their coats, the worn-through soles of their shoes, the way they tried to make themselves small and invisible against the raw clapboard wall. The townsfolk flowed around them like a river around a stone, their gazes sliding past, refusing to acknowledge the stark tableau of desperation. The woman's face was pale and drawn, but her spine was straight, a single, defiant line against the crushing weight of their circumstance. Her hands, chapped and red, were tucked under the arms of the little girl, who shivered violently, her face buried in her mother's skirt. The boy, older by a few years, stood slightly in front of them, his chin jutting out in a poor imitation of a man's defiance, his eyes darting with a fear he was trying desperately to conceal. The rancher watched them for a long moment. He was not a man given to pity. Pity was a soft, useless thing, and the world he inhabited had no place for it. What he felt was a flicker of recognition. He knew the shape of their silence. It was different from his own, which was born of loss and isolation, but it was a silence nonetheless, the silence of having nothing left to say, no one left to say it to. He saw the cold working on them, not just the biting wind, but the deeper, more insidious chill of indifference from the people passing by. He finished loading his supplies onto the buckboard, his movements deliberate, methodical. He tied down the canvas cover, his gloved hands sure and practiced on the knots. All the while, his mind worked. His ranch was large, the house larger than one man needed. It was a home built for a life that no longer existed, for voices that had been silenced by fever and a harsh winter 5 years past. The silence in his cabin was becoming too loud to bear, a ringing emptiness that work alone could not fill. He needed a cook. He needed someone to manage the house. The thought was a practical one, a solution to two problems. It had nothing to do with charity. He told himself this with stern finality. He walked back across the street, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The sound was loud in the quiet air, and the woman looked up as he approached. Her eyes were dark with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, but there was no plea in them. There was only a guarded, waiting stillness. He stopped a few feet away, keeping a respectful distance. He did not look at the children. He addressed the woman directly. "You need work," he stated. It was not a question. She flinched almost imperceptibly, a tightening around her mouth. "We are fine," she said, her voice low and rough from the cold. It was a lie, and they both knew it, but her pride was a thin, tattered coat she refused to shed. He ignored the lie. "I have a ranch. North of here. I need a housekeeper. Someone to cook and clean. I provide a roof, food. I pay a wage." He let the words settle in the frozen air between them. He did not soften the offer, did not dress it in the language of kindness. It was a transaction, plain and simple. The woman looked from his impassive face to her children. She saw the blue tint on the little girl's lips, the tremor in her son's hands. Her pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. The struggle was visible in the taut line of her jaw, a battle fought and lost in the space of a single, ragged breath. "The children," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They stay with me." "That's the arrangement," he confirmed with a nod. He looked up at the sky, a flat, unforgiving sheet of gray. The storm's coming. My wagon is over there. Be in it in 5 minutes if you're coming. He turned and walked away without waiting for an answer, without looking back. He knew she would follow. She had no other choice. The world had narrowed to this single, stark path, and he was the one standing at its beginning. He climbed onto the buckboard seat, took up the reins, and waited. The silence stretched. Then, he heard the soft scuff of worn shoes on the frozen earth. The woman lifted the little girl into the back, and the boy scrambled up after her. She climbed up last, settling herself among the sacks and crates, her back straight, her face turned away from him, a portrait of reluctant surrender. The journey to the homestead was made in a silence as vast and profound as the landscape itself. The wagon wheels groaned in the frozen ruts, and the wind picked up, a low, mournful howl that swept across the plains, carrying the scent of snow and distance. He had a spare wool blanket, thick and coarse, folded behind the seat. Without a word, he reached back and offered it to her. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it, her cold fingers brushing against his glove. She wrapped it first around the little girl, then the boy, and finally pulled a corner over her own shoulders. It was an act of care, but it felt as impersonal as the exchange of coin for goods, a necessary part of their new arrangement. He felt her eyes on his back occasionally, a questioning, searching gaze, but he kept his own fixed on the horizon, on the familiar, jagged line of the mountains that marked the border of his world. They arrived as dusk was bleeding its last gray light from the sky. The homestead was nestled in a shallow valley, protected from the worst of the wind by a stand of old-growth pines. The house was solid, built of thick, hand-hewn logs, with a stone chimney breathing a thin plume of smoke from the fire he kept banked. There were 2 barns, a corral, and a series of fences, all in good repair, all speaking of a life of hard, ceaseless work. It was a place of stark function, not comfort. It was the home of a man who did not live in it so much as occupy it. Inside, the main room was dominated by a large stone fireplace. The furniture was simple, sturdy, and sparse. A long trestle table with 2 benches, a single armchair near the hearth, a collection of shelves holding a few books and tin plates. The entire space was immaculately clean but profoundly empty. There were no small touches, no curtains on the windows, no rug on the floor, nothing to soften the hard edges of solitude. It was a space that held the echo of a long-held grief. He gestured toward the fire. "Get them warm," while the woman and her children huddled near the flames, soaking in the radiant heat. He moved about the room with quiet efficiency. He lit a lantern, its yellow glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. He put a pot of stew on the hearth to warm, and set out 3 bowls and spoons on the table. When the food was ready, he served them, placing the bowls before them without a word. The children ate with a desperate, ravenous hunger that spoke of days of deprivation. The boy shoveled the food into his mouth, his eyes never leaving his bowl. The little girl ate more slowly, her small hands clumsy with the spoon. The woman ate with a quiet, measured dignity, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she forced herself to swallow slowly, as if to prove she was not starving. He sat in his armchair, nursing a cup of coffee, watching them with a detached curiosity. He was not their savior. He was their employer. They were not guests. They were a necessity he had acquired. The gulf between their states of being was a vast, unspoken thing in the warm, firelit room. When they had finished, he took the bowls. "There's a loft," he said, pointing to a sturdy ladder in the corner. "Hay is clean. Plenty of blankets up there. It's warm enough." The message was clear. They were to be separate. The kindness of a roof and a hot meal had its limits, and those limits were drawn at the edge of his personal space. The woman nodded, her face unreadable. "Thank you," she said, the words stiff. She herded her children toward the ladder, and they climbed into the shadows of the loft. He heard the rustle of hay and blankets, a few whispered words, and then a profound silence fell over the house again. But it was a different kind of silence. It was no longer empty. It was occupied. It was a silence that held the soft, rhythmic breathing of 3 other souls, and he found he did not know what to do with it. The kindness he had offered, born of a cold and logical pragmatism, felt as sharp and dangerous as the winter itself. The storm arrived that night. a blizzard that descended from the mountains and smothered the world in a swirling chaos of white. For 3 days, they were confined to the house, prisoners of the weather. A period of adjustment began, a silent negotiation of shared space. The rancher moved through his routines with the same unhurried deliberation as always, but he was acutely aware of their presence. The soft pad of the woman's feet on the floorboards, the children's hushed whispers from the loft, the smell of the simple bread she baked in his oven. He was a man who was always working, always in motion, as if stillness might allow the silence to reclaim him. He mended harnesses in front of the fire, his powerful hands surprisingly nimble. He sharpened tools, the scrape of whetstone on steel a rhythmic, lonely sound. The woman, for her part, began to impose a quiet order on the house. She cleaned with a thoroughness that bordered on fierce, scrubbing away the invisible film of neglect. She found a box of his late wife's things packed away in a small storage room: linens, curtains, sewing supplies. She approached him one evening as he was reading by the firelight. "May I?" she asked, holding up a pair of simple muslin curtains. He looked at them, and for a moment, the ghost of another woman's hands was in the room. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a cold fist of memory. He gave a curt nod, his eyes returning to his book, though the words on the page had blurred. The next day, the windows were covered, softening the harsh winter light and lending the room a semblance of warmth it had not known in years. She did not ask again. She simply worked, mending the children's clothes, then her needle moving with a swift, practiced rhythm. She was making her value known, proving that this was a fair exchange. When the storm finally broke, it left behind a world transformed, buried under a deep, pristine blanket of snow. The air was sharp and clean, the sky a brilliant, aching blue. The work that had been postponed by the blizzard now clamored for attention. The rancher pulled on his heaviest coat and boots, preparing to dig out the paths to the barns. As he reached for the door, the woman spoke from behind him. "We will help." It was not a plea but a statement. He turned, ready to refuse. The boy was too small, the work too heavy. But he saw the look on her face, the same defiant pride he had seen in town, now tempered with a quiet resolve. She would not accept charity. They would not be sheltered pets while he labored. They would earn their place. "The snow is deep," he said, his voice gruff. "We have hands," she replied simply. The boy stood beside her, his shoulders squared, trying to look taller than he was. The rancher hesitated, then gave another of his curt nods. He found smaller shovels in the barn, and they set to work. He had expected them to tire quickly, to retreat to the warmth of the house. He was wrong. The woman worked with a steady, relentless pace, her face set in concentration, her breath pluming in the frigid air. The boy, eager to prove himself, shoveled with a frantic energy, his face red with effort. The little girl, wrapped in blankets, was tasked with carrying kindling to the house, a small but important job she took with solemn seriousness. He watched them out of the corner of his eye. He saw their resilience, their refusal to be broken by hardship. They were not fragile things to be protected, but fellow survivors who knew the calculus of work and survival. He found himself adjusting his own pace to match the woman's, falling into a silent rhythm with her. Shovel, lift, toss. Shovel, lift, toss. It was a shared labor, a silent conversation spoken in the language of exhaustion and determination. That afternoon, while clearing a space in the tack room, the boy accidentally knocked over a small, locked trunk. The latch broke, and the lid fell open. Inside, nestled among old leather-bound ledgers, was a single, faded watercolor of a little girl with a bright red ribbon in her hair. The boy froze, his eyes wide with guilt and surprise. The rancher came over, his expression unreadable. He looked at the painting, and the silence in the small room became heavy, filled with the presence of a ghost. He gently closed the lid, his movements slow and deliberate. "It's all right," he said, his voice softer than they had ever heard it. Accidents happen, he did not speak of it again, but a small, crucial piece of his past had been revealed, a crack in the stoic facade he presented to the world. A quiet, unspoken understanding began to grow in the spaces between them, nurtured by shared work and the gruff, absolute patience he showed them as they learned the rhythms of his world. The first trip back to town was a necessity. Supplies were low, and news of the wider world was needed. The journey felt different this time. The woman and her children sat on the bench beside him, no longer relegated to the back like cargo. A fragile sense of belonging had begun to take root in the frozen soil of their arrangement. The town, however, had not changed. As they moved through the mercantile, the rancher felt the weight of curious and judgmental stares. Whispers followed them like stray dogs, nipping at their heels. He ignored them, his face a mask of indifference, but he could feel the woman stiffen beside him, her protective arm around her daughter's shoulders. As they were leaving, their path was blocked. A woman stood before them, dressed in a fine wool coat with a fur collar, her face set in a mask of pleasant, condescending inquiry. She was the wife of the town's most prosperous landowner, a woman who wielded social standing like a weapon and considered the town's morality her personal jurisdiction. Her appearance, so clean and manicured, was a stark contrast to their rough-hewn, work-worn world. "Well now," she began, her voice sweet as poison. "It seems you've acquired some help." Her eyes swept over the widow and her children, a quick, dismissive appraisal that catalogued their mended clothes and foreign features. She addressed the rancher, but her words were aimed at the woman beside him. "It is so charitable of you to take in strays. But one must be careful. A man living alone, with a woman of her situation. People will talk." The attack was as clear as if she had thrown a stone. It was public shaming, an assertion of her dominance, an attempt to poison the fragile peace they had built. The air grew thick with tension. The other patrons in the store fell silent, their eyes wide with anticipation. The widow's face went pale, but she did not look down. She met the woman's cruel gaze with a quiet, burning dignity. Before she could speak, the rancher moved. It was a small, simple motion. He took half a step forward, placing himself slightly in front of the widow and her children. The gesture was unmistakable. He was a shield. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His quiet authority filled the space, more powerful than any shout. "They are with me," he said, his voice low and flat, leaving no room for argument. He met the matriarch's gaze, and his eyes, cold as a winter sky, held no trace of fear or apology. "Her situation is her own. My roof is my own. What people talk about is their own business, not mine." He had publicly and unequivocally placed them under his protection. The confrontation was one not with anger, but with an unshakable, quiet certainty. The matriarch's smile faltered. She had expected him to be embarrassed, to back down. His defiance left her with nowhere to go. A flush of angry color rose in her cheeks. "Well, I never," she sputtered, clutching her purse. "I imagine you haven't," the rancher replied, his tone unchanging. He nodded once, a gesture of dismissal, and guided the widow and her children past the stunned woman and out of the store. The ride back to the ranch was wrapped in a silence that was heavier and more complicated than any that had come before. The fragile peace had been shattered. He had defended them, yes, but in doing so, he had drawn a line in the sand, making their private arrangement a public concern. The matriarch's attack had been a warning shot, and now they were all caught in the open. The unspoken things between them crowded the wagon, heavy with the weight of what had just happened and the uncertainty of what was to come. The sanctuary of the ranch suddenly felt much more vulnerable. That evening, the tension in the small house was a palpable thing. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it could not warm the chill that had settled between them. The children were quiet, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, and went up to the loft early. The rancher sat in his armchair, staring into the flames, the book in his lap forgotten. The widow stood by the window, looking out at the vast, star-dusted darkness. The silence stretched, filled with the ghosts of the day's ugly confrontation. Finally, she turned from the window, her silhouette framed against the deep blue of the night. She broke the silence with a question, direct and unadorned. "Why did you help us?" He did not look at her. He continued to stare into the fire, his jaw tight. The question hung in the air, sharp as a shard of glass. It was the question he had been avoiding, the truth he had buried under layers of pragmatism and logic. He had told himself he needed a cook, a housekeeper. He had told himself it was a simple transaction. But the scene in the mercantile had stripped that lie bare. His defense of her had not been the act of an employer. It had been the act of a protector. A long time passed, The only sound was the hiss and pop of the burning logs. He thought she might give up, might retreat back into their careful, unspoken arrangement. But she waited, patient and still. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, dredged up from a place of deep, settled pain. This house was built for 4 people, he paused, the words costing him more than he had spent in years. My wife, Sarah. My daughter, Emily. The fever took them. 5 years ago this winter. He finally turned his head, and in the flickering firelight, she saw the profound, unending grief in his eyes. After they were gone, the silence. It got loud. Too loud. A man can lose himself in that kind of quiet. It's too much nothing. He looked over at her, at the way she stood so straight and defiant against the darkness. You and your children. You had nothing left. I had too much nothing. I thought, maybe you could make a better kind of silence here. It was the most honest thing he had ever said, a confession that laid his own brokenness bare. He had not rescued her from the cold. He had invited her in to save him from the emptiness. She listened, her expression softening with an empathy born of her own loss. His vulnerability was a bridge, and she crossed it without hesitation. She walked over to the small wooden chest where she kept her few meager possessions. From it, she took a small, cloth-wrapped object. She returned to the fire and held it out to him. It was a small, intricately carved bird, its wings outstretched, made from a dark, polished wood he did not recognize. One of its wings was broken, the tip sheared cleanly off. My husband made this, she said, her voice soft but steady. He was a carpenter, a good man. He died in a mill accident. His brother is not a good man. He said my husband owed him a great debt. He produced papers, signed by a judge in his pocket. He claimed everything. The house, the tools, even the children. He said they were his wards, to work off the debt. He saw us as property. She traced the line of the broken wing with her finger. We ran in the night. We have been running ever since. That woman in town. She sees a stray. She doesn't see a mother trying to keep her children from being sold into servitude. The 2 revelations, spoken into the quiet intimacy of the firelit room, changed everything. The last barriers of their transactional arrangement crumbled into dust. They were no longer simply an employer and an employee, a rescuer and the rescued. They were survivors, each bearing the scars of a profound loss, each fighting a different kind of silence. He looked from the broken bird in her hand to her face, and he understood. The true danger was not the town's gossip or the matriarch's prejudice. The true danger was a well-dressed, smug man with a set of legal papers who would one day come to collect his property. He realized then that he had to offer not just a roof, but a fortress. He had to become not just a provider, but a guardian. The quiet life he had sought to build was over. A war was coming to his door. The war arrived 2 months later, on a day when the first signs of a thaw had begun to soften the iron-hard ground. A handsome carriage, entirely out of place in the rugged landscape, pulled up before the house. From it stepped a man in a fine city suit, his boots polished to a high sheen, his face fixed in a smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. It was the brother-in-law. He moved with the smug confidence of a man who believed the world was a ledger book and that all debts were his to collect. He did not wait to be invited in. He strode onto the porch as the rancher came out to meet him, the widow and her children watching with wide, fearful eyes from the doorway. I am here for what is mine, the brother-in-law announced, his voice smooth and proprietary. He produced a sheaf of papers from his coat pocket. A legal writ, signed and sealed. It grants me guardianship of the children and settles the matter of their mother's debt to my family estate. You have been harboring a fugitive and my property. The rancher stood before him, a solid, immovable obstacle. They are not property, he said, his voice a low rumble. And this is my land. You're not welcome here. The brother-in-law laughed, a short, unpleasant sound. Your land, perhaps. But the law is the law. The circuit judge will be in town in 3 days. I have already spoken with the marshal. He will be here with the judge to enforce the order. You have until then to hand them over willingly. After that, his smile widened. It could become unpleasant for everyone. He gave a mock bow, turned on his heel, and returned to his carriage, leaving his ultimatum hanging in the air like the stench of something rotten. The immediate aftermath was a wave of cold, quiet despair. The widow looked utterly defeated, the fight draining from her face. The children clung to her, their small faces pale with terror. But the rancher's face was set like granite. The emptiness inside him had been replaced by a cold, burning purpose. "He will not take you," he said, and it was a vow. That night, the house became a war room. They sat at the long trestle table, the lantern casting a pool of determined light on their faces. "Tell me everything," the rancher commanded. The widow, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger as she spoke, recounted every detail of her husband's business, the supposed debt, the brother-in-law's treachery. She revealed a hidden skill he had never suspected. She was not only literate but had a keen mind for figures, having kept her husband's books for years. "The debt was a lie," she insisted, her finger tracing an imaginary column of figures on the tabletop. "My husband was meticulous. He owed nothing. The papers must be forgeries." For 2 days, they worked. They pored over the few account books she had managed to save, searching for any proof, any loophole. The rancher, meanwhile, made a desperate, long-shot move. He rode hard into town and sent a coded telegraph. It was addressed to a name from a past he never spoke of, an old army captain he had served under, a man who now worked in the territorial capital, a man who knew how to navigate the corridors of power and had an eye for corruption. The message was short, detailing the brother-in-law's name, his claim, and the jurisdiction he came from, ending with a single, urgent plea: investigate. Urgent. It was a shot in the dark, a prayer sent down a thin metal wire, and their only hope. On the 3rd day, the air was thick with dread. The sun rose, and with it came the sound of approaching horses. The brother-in-law returned, and this time he was not alone. The town marshal, a weary man who followed the letter of the law, rode beside him. And trailing behind them, her face a mask of vindicated triumph, was the town matriarch, there to witness the downfall of the outsiders and the man who had dared to defend them. They dismounted. The marshal held the writ in his hand, his expression grim. "I'm sorry," he said to the rancher. "The paper is legal. I have to enforce it." The brother-in-law stepped forward, his smile triumphant. "The time for games is over. Get the children." The rancher stood on the porch, his hand resting on the frame of the door where the widow and children huddled behind him. He did not move. He was buying time, his eyes scanning the horizon, searching for a miracle that he knew was unlikely to come. The marshal took a step forward, his hand moving toward his sidearm. And then they heard it. The frantic, desperate drumming of a horse's hooves, galloping at a breakneck pace. A lone rider appeared over the rise, urging his horse on, a small cloud of dust billowing behind him. It was the telegraph operator's son, a boy who was paid $1 to ride faster than he ever had in his life. He slid his horse to a stop, his chest heaving, and thrust a yellow envelope into the rancher's hand. The rancher tore it open. The silence was absolute, as every eye was fixed on him. He read the short message, and for the first time since they had met him, a slow, grim smile touched his lips. He handed the paper to the marshal. The marshal read it, his eyebrows rising with each word. He read it a second time, then looked up, his gaze hard and sharp, fixed on the brother-in-law. "Well now," the marshal said, his voice suddenly cold as steel. "It seems this telegram from the territorial attorney's office has a different story to tell." He held up the paper. "Says here a man matching your description is wanted. For fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. Says here the family estate you claim is bankrupt, and that you've been forging documents to swindle creditors for months. Says here this writ." He crumpled the document in his fist. "Is worthless." The color drained from the brother-in-law's face. His smug confidence evaporated, replaced by the raw, panicked fear of a cornered rat. He made a move to run, but the marshal was faster. In 2 strides, he had the man's arm twisted behind his back, snapping manacles onto his wrists. "Looks like you'll be accompanying me back to town after all," the marshal grunted. The town matriarch stood frozen, her face a picture of disbelief and utter humiliation. Her moment of triumph had turned to ash. The lawman tipped his hat to the rancher, a gesture of profound, earned respect. "Looks like you had it handled." He turned, shoving his prisoner toward his horse, and the small posse of justice and injustice rode away, leaving behind a stunned, victorious silence. The spring that followed was not just a changing of the seasons, it was the beginning of a new life. The thaw came to the land, and with it, A thaw came to the solitary heart of the rancher. The harsh, empty silence of his house was gone forever, replaced by the soft, warm sounds of a family. The little girl's laughter as she chased butterflies in the new grass, the boy's earnest questions as he worked alongside the rancher, learning to mend fences and care for the stock, and the woman's quiet humming as she tended the small garden she had planted near the kitchen door. The ranch itself was transformed. It was no longer a place of solitude and memory, but a thriving, lively home. New curtains, sewn by the widow's hand from bolts of cheerful calico, brightened the windows. A porch swing appeared, built by the rancher and the boy on long, sun-drenched afternoons. The most significant change was the addition he began to build onto the side of the house. 2 new rooms, a project of lumber and nails that was a clear, unspoken statement about the future. It was a physical manifestation of growth, an admission that their lives were now permanently intertwined. The people were transformed as well. The rancher, once defined by his grief, now found reasons to smile. The lines of sorrow on his face were softened by a quiet contentment. He was no longer just a man occupying a space. He was the head of a household, a protector, a teacher, and something very much like a father. The loud silence that had haunted him for 5 years had been filled, not with noise, but with the gentle, life-affirming presence of others. The widow was no longer the desperate, haunted woman from the town street. She stood taller, her quiet strength now radiating a calm confidence. She was a partner in the enterprise of the ranch, her intelligence and resilience proving indispensable. Her reputation in town, once the subject of vicious gossip, had been restored by the public humiliation of the matriarch and the story of the brother-in-law's arrest. She was now seen not as an outsider, but as the capable woman who had, alongside the rancher, faced down injustice and won. The children, most of all, had blossomed. Freed from the constant terror of flight and uncertainty, they became who they were meant to be. The boy grew strong and capable, his youthful imitation of a man replaced by a genuine competence and a deep, abiding respect for the man who had given them a safe harbor. The little girl, once a shy, shivering waif, was now full of light and laughter, her trust in the world restored. By the time winter began to hint at its return, the children would not have let her leave for anything. The ranch was their home. The rancher was their family. One evening, as the sun set in a spectacular blaze of orange and purple behind the mountains, the found family sat together on the new porch swing. The children were on a blanket on the porch floor, playing a quiet game with polished stones. The rancher and the widow sat side by side, the swing moving in a slow, gentle rhythm. A comfortable silence settled between them, no longer empty or tense, but full of unspoken understanding and shared peace. He looked out at the vast expanse of his land, at the long shadows stretching across the valley. It was the same land he had looked at for years, but he saw it now with new eyes. It was no longer just a place to work and endure. It was a sanctuary, a future. A home is not the land you own, he said, his voice quiet but sure, speaking a truth he had only recently come to understand. He looked at her, and she met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the warm light of the setting sun. It is the people you choose to protect on it. She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her whole face. She reached out and placed her hand over his on the rough wood of the swing. It was a simple touch, but it was a promise. They had weathered the harshest of winters, both outside and within, and had emerged into the warmth of a new season, together. The silence was finally, truly, a better kind of silence. It was peace.